but it's okay. Part of the job.
Yeah, hopefully we can cleanse. We can do some emptying, in fact.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes, some releasement, as it were. Um, yeah, how are things going for you?
Yeah, good. Busy just catching up on stuff after the trip to India. And this morning I've been frantically editing a review on next generation snakebite therapeutics that I just got roped into like last night. And there's a very close deadline. So
Hmm.
um, yeah, there's always lots on. Yeah, very exciting and enlivening trip to India, and lots of important work to do there, and lots of fascinating wildlife and fascinating discussions had with collaborators and new friends over there. So it's always a nice place to visit.
Yeah. So you're there basically to help with this problem of snakes getting into people's houses and killing 60,000 people a year, and that's a crazy number.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not mostly snakes getting into people's houses that are killing that many people, to be clear. I mean, for a really brief rundown, the community based project that I was there for this time, um, they are doing everything from collecting venoms from local snakes, local to their region and local to the state of Karnataka, to then supply free of charge to antivenom manufacturers, because currently one of the many issues with snakebite in India is that all venoms come from a single locality in Chennai on the east coast, and there's a lot of regional variation in venom composition, and that's an issue when you have you know horses that have only been exposed to snakes from a particular region developing antibodies specific to those snakes, those toxins, and then you don't get this good broad spectrum coverage, basically. So that's one of the aspects of the project. So I've helped them set up their lab. And then there are a couple of, somewhat more exciting aspects to the project, one of which is behavioral research on kraits, so snakes in the genus Bungarus, which are elapid snakes, front-fanged venomous snakes. Elapidae is one of the two major families of front-fang venomous snakes, along with Viperidae, and one of the three clades in which the front-fang state has evolved in snakes. I mean, we could easily spend the rest of the chat talking about this, but
Yeah.
these kraits are they present a particular kind of issue because of what you referenced, which is that they do enter people's houses and bite people while they're asleep. So one of the things we want to do is behavioral research on the kraits to understand, how they're responding to scent trails, and what are the conditions which trigger a bite, and are there differences, for example, between defensive bites and offensive bites in the amount of venom delivered, that sort of stuff. Uh,
Mm.
so the prevailing wisdom, though, is that these are rodent eating. They're generalists. They eat all sorts of things, but they love to eat rodents, and they are following rodent scent trails into people's homes. And it's always important to note we're talking about the rural poor, really. So we're talking about people living in living in homes that are not snake proof, basically, and where there might be a lot of rodents in and around the home. And so snakes are entering the home just looking for a meal in the usual way. And we think that they're probably so kind of keyed up on rodent scent that they are essentially contact biters. Like whenever they contact a sort of warm mammalian object, they will react as though it's a rodent. This is a hypothesis, but basically these are not. There are lots of different modes of foraging and prey capture in snakes, including in venomous snakes, and these snakes are not particularly, fast and accurate strikers. They're active foragers. And my feeling is, although we know so little about the ecology of a lot of snakes, and that's part of the reasons for this research, my feeling is that they probably follow rodents under sort of, non-human, I was going to say natural, but of course, we want to get rid of that nature culture divide if we
Mhm.
can. But under other circumstances, more in keeping with their evolutionary history, they probably follow rodent scent trails to rodent burrows, and they go into rodent burrows, and then they are, in the dark, their eyesight doesn't seem to be particularly good for this particular group of snakes. So they're very scent oriented, and then they're just going to bite anything that sort of moves or is, warm and mammal like in the dark. And that's probably how they manage to catch rodents, which are of course very fast moving and alert. So this kind of snake, I suspect, has a great difficulty in catching a rodent out in the open, basically. And we see this kind of phenotype, this behavioral phenotype, and its associated morphology arise in many different snake lineages. And an opposite phenotype, which we're also investigating, so the other part of the project is telemetry of Russell's vipers. So radio tracking Russell's vipers to work out how they're using the habitat, basically, and particularly in these sort of disturbed rural habitats where they come into contact with people often. And Russell's vipers are a sit and wait predator. They will, of course, also forage, find a scent trail, but then they'll just station themselves next to that scent trail, waiting for something to come along. And then they are very, very fast and very accurate strikers. And they subdue rodents incredibly rapidly. So their bite and release is their prey handling modality, but a rodent bitten by a Russell's viper doesn't get far. It's within 20 seconds it's immobilized, and within 30 or 40 it's quite possibly dead. So different modalities of snake foraging bring humans into contact with snakes in different ways, and Russell's vipers, at least in this area in South India, are far and away, we believe, the biggest culprit for snakebite to humans. And so what we think, again, the basic generic idea is that snakes sit by scent trails, which are also pathways that humans use. And so people step next to them. And again, one of the things we want to investigate is what are the circumstances that actually trigger a bite? Because we know sometimes people, maybe even tread on snakes and don't get bitten, but sometimes people tread, near snakes and do get bitten. And, we're not sure about what's going on there. And so a big part of the project is basically human snake ecology, interactions between humans and snakes that lead to bites, rather than just, another lab that I have a long-term collaboration with in India, actually run by a guy that we did our PhDs at the same time, and we've been collaborating ever since. And he's at the Indian Institute of Science. This is Kartik Sunagar. He's doing a lot of amazing work on novel therapeutics, so next generation antivenoms, and also improving antivenom production and all that sort of stuff. So whilst there's a little aspect of that in this community-based project, it's more about the snake behavior, but also human behavior. Like when we know those things about, when we hopefully discover some more fine-grained detail about the snake behavior, can we also take that kind of knowledge into local communities and talk to people like, these are the circumstances in which these snakes are likely to bite, and how can we address things at that prevention level rather than the level of cure? Because as you referenced, we think there may be, some 60,000 snakebite fatalities in India every year. India is the world's most afflicted region for snakebite envenoming. Sub-Saharan Africa coming in at a fairly close second. And it's always an interesting thing for me coming from Australia, because Australia, yes, has this huge reputation. Everything in Australia is out to kill you and blah, blah, blah. And we have snakes that can kill 250,000 rodents with a single bite, and, all this crap that's part of our national identity, and which I've spent a lot of my career trying to nuance. And the reality is we have 2 to 3 snakebite deaths every year in Australia. And that's, every death is obviously a tragedy. And if we can prevent them, we want to. But compare with 60,000 and over 30,000 in sub-Saharan Africa. And then for every fatal bite, one has to imagine, and we do know, there are several times as many cases of long-term morbidity. And that's everything from crippling damage to bitten limbs. And remember, we're talking about the rural poor, so that's taking people, off the land, making it impossible for them to work. They're probably hit with a significant cost of the antivenom therapy, and they stay in hospital, so people go into debt. It's a terrible situation there. Everything from that to just PTSD. If you've had a really nasty encounter with a snake, you might find it very difficult, even if you aren't physically disabled, to get out there and start, and work or or what have you. So it's a complex, we say or the World Health Organization says, a multifactorial issue. There's a lot to do.
Wow.
And it is fascinating. It's fascinating how these things are so context specific. This might segue us into, epochal configurations of, dominant constraint functions and this sort of, metaphysics and ontology that we're going to talk about in this paper today. But it's fascinating how context specific these issues are. And just for one final thing on that note, my group were also just wrapping up this 3-year anti-venom distribution program in Papua New Guinea. So Papua New Guinea, obviously immediately to Australia's north. And the snakes that are a big issue in Papua New Guinea are actually Australian snakes that have migrated north during periods of where there have been land, like low ocean level, low sea level. So there have been land bridges. This is really interesting from an evolutionary perspective. I mean, all of this stuff is interesting from an evolutionary and ecological perspective. But, elapid snakes, so these front fang venomous snakes, they came to Australia from Asia. So when the Australian plate, moved, or like Gondwana broke up, Australian plate moved around and then cracked into the Asian plate. Over the past like 25 million plus years, there have been all these radiations of organisms from Asia through all these little land bridges and island hopping chains from Southeast Asia to Australasia. And amongst the migrants were these front fang venomous snakes. And in Australia, we didn't have any of those. We had pythons and we had blind snakes, 30 million years ago. And so when these snakes arrived in Australia, they kind of just exploded. Like there's this huge Australian radiation, which is part of how we get the reputation that we have, the undeserved reputation. But we are the only continent in which venomous
I'll try to
snakes.
stop propagating that stereotype since I've learned so much from you about how nuanced it really is.
Yeah.
And
Well,
yeah.
and it's just way more interesting when you nuance it. But and I'll shut up in a second. But the snakes came here. They encountered all this open niche space for like snaky predators that was unoccupied. So they kind of exploded, and we have about half of all the world's members of this particular family just in Australia. And then some of them took to the seas or took back to the seas because we think it was kind of an amphibious snake that came here. And we have this big radiation of so-called true sea snakes, live-bearing sea snakes that give birth in the water that are also essentially Australasian, even though at least one species is pan-tropical. The yellow-bellied sea snake is a pelagic species that you get in the US. That's come from Australia in kind of evolutionary terms, biogeographical terms. But whilst the snakes were migrating through Southeast Asia, they were kind of leaving some snakes behind. So some snakes were like, oh, this huge landmass, Papua New Guinea, this is a good place to be, and they stayed there. And so there are these Melanesian snakes. And then they actually kept going east all the way along the island chain. And there's like one really bizarre little burrowing elapid all the way out in Fiji, right? So they go through the Solomons and they go all the way out there. But they came to Australia, they exploded, and then some of them much more recently migrated, like very recently, migrated back to New Guinea. And this includes the taipans, the death adders, and the brown snakes. And taipans and death adders are basically the most medically significant snakes in PNG. And the point here is the context specificity of what goes on with snakebite. We have tons of taipans and obviously death adders in Australia, but taipans in particular, the Australian coastal taipan, it occurs from about halfway up the Australian eastern coast, all the way across the top up to the northwest. But it's either in like remote areas or where it's in, where it's in areas with more dense human population, and in particular where it's common in cane fields, in agricultural settings, in northeastern Australia. The people in those settings are like sitting in combine harvesters, like driving through cane fields, mulching cane, and the only snakes they see are chopped into a bunch of pieces, or maybe they see one on a trail every now and then when they're walking through. But in New Guinea, that exact same snake, it's just in and amongst where people are living and people are walking barefoot. And it's a particularly, I don't like to say any snakes are nasty. The venom is particularly nasty. And it's a snake that if you do come too close to it, it has a higher chance of biting you than some other snakes, let's say. And it, injects a lot of a very, very potent venom. And so while in Australia, we almost never have Taipan bites are rare and taipan fatalities are incredibly rare. We think they kill like more than 1,000 people every year in New Guinea. And so again, same snakes, just different way that people are living, different health infrastructure. And so what we've been doing for the last 3 years is distributing antivenom, Australian-made antivenom. So there's a good drug has been available, but the Papuan government hadn't been able to afford enough of it. Plus, they hadn't been able to get enough of it to different rural health centers. It's also a cold chain product, so it's got to be kept cold. So over the years, partly from work from people in my group, some of whom have left, but the Australian government has essentially been convinced, along with the manufacturers of Australian antivenom, to donate antivenoms to Papua New Guinea and to set up this distribution program. And we're just writing up the results of that now, because we have patient data forms that, that we get one filled out for every single vial of antivenom that's been administered. And anyway, so there's lots of interesting stuff there, but yeah. How dangerous a snake is basically is very much a factor of your health infrastructure and the way humans are living in the environments in which those snakes occur. It's not the snake species, and it's not even the abundance of snakes. It's also the abundance of humans, right? Like Australia is incredibly sparsely populated. So all of these things come into it. So when you get involved in this kind of research, I'm an evolutionary biologist, right? So I'm into like snakes and what they're doing, their feeding ecology, and how that, feeds back onto the molecular evolution of the genes that encode their toxins. And that's all like incredibly fascinating stuff. But in the snakebite space, you're getting into everything from, distribution programs, human, like, educational outreach for local communities, snake behavior, all kinds of fascinating stuff kind of intersects there.
Yeah. So toxinologist by day, musician and philosopher by night. Really interesting to learn a bit about the research that you're involved in with snakes. And it does raise the question. You were already trying to draw a few connections here, but early on in this article by Reiner Schürmann. I'm trying to find the way to pronounce the German in a way that doesn't just sound like the English Sherman, but I'm not sure if I actually still possess the phoneme to do it, or ever did, rather.
I think everyone just calls him Reiner Schürmann, and he was in the US for the last sort of 20 plus years of his life, so I'm sure
he's at the new school, yeah. But yeah, he talks about, in just the second paragraph there, about cultural networks of exchange, and obviously cites Derrida with the excerpt from Margins of Philosophy right at the start. And it got me thinking about semiotics and whether we're working in a binary semiotics of Ferdinand de Saussure, or whether we're working with a triadic semiotics like our friend Charles Saunders Peirce, and the way in which the triadic approach lets us break out of any sense of a like semiotic enclosure within cultural signs to acknowledge that, hey, snakes are engaged in a process of sign interpretation in their ecologies. And to the extent that we have these issues to deal with of, human beings getting bitten, we're trying to translate between different species modes of sign interpretation. And I'm not so sure that, and I know Derrida has engaged with, both Saussure and Peirce of grammatology, right? And so he's aware of this, but he's critical of both of them in different ways. But I think usually, besides when he's thinking about his cat, Derrida is kind of within that cultural network of signs and not thinking too much about biosemiotics. So that's one sort of aside that occurred to me in thinking through this, especially if we're trying to break out of these, the representational paradigm that Heidegger is so concerned about, and the ways that we wield concepts like weapons to master the world, instead of learning to translate between doing a kind of interspecies communication, basically. That a biosemiotic, triadic semiotic would allow us to, I think, make more headway in doing.
And just on that note, in chemical ecology, they do refer to those molecules that organisms use to mediate interactions with other molecules, so the subject area of chemical ecology, as semiochemicals.
Hmm.
Uh, and of course, some of them are very obviously analogous to the kinds of communications we're very familiar with, pheromones and different things that are very explicitly or obviously sending a signal from one organism to another. And there are all sorts of fascinating examples that we could obviously discuss there. But a defensive toxin. So toxins I define as so toxinology is disciplinarily siloed from chemical ecology, generally speaking, right? So people use very different terminology, and but I'm trying to work in the margins of those fields, and a toxin is just a molecule that's used to mediate an antagonistic interaction between organisms. And toxins can do all kinds of different things, right? But generally have a deleterious effect, or are intended, are selected for having a deleterious effect on the target organism. And when snakes bite humans, except for maybe these unusual cases with crates, like cases of mistaken identity. And we get a similar phenomenon actually in sub-Saharan Africa with spitting cobras, similarly foraging at night, entering people's homes and entering them. But the majority of bites, well, there are mistaken identity bites and there are explicitly defensive bites. And a lot of snake bite to human, we feel is explicitly defensive. Snakes see humans as a threat, and very legitimately, of course. Humans will very often kill snakes on sight because humans see snakes as a threat. And a defensive toxin is a kind of message. It's a message like, do not mess with me, basically, And of course, some snakes have aposematic coloration and things as well. But even in that case where the toxins are defensively deployed and actually lead to the death of the target organism, like 60,000 people per year in India, there is still a signal being sent to the lineage, right? Avoid these things. Of course, it can backfire, and the message might be interpreted as kill these things on sight. But nonetheless, there is an attempt to communicate something there.
But just internal to human sign systems, semiotic systems, cultural networks of exchange, at least in the Western world, with the role of the serpent in the Garden of Eden, there's definitely an association between snakes and evil,
Yeah.
and danger. And I'm not sure to what extent that is present in India or in some of these other Southeast Asian cultures.
Well, I think snakes are in both the West and elsewhere actually kind of always pharmacon. If we're going to keep
Right.
with
Yeah.
Derek here, snakes in the West, look at the staff of Hermes, the caduceus.
Right.
Look at look at the staff rather of Asclepius. So the caduceus, obviously Hermes
Yeah.
staff has the two snakes and then the wings. So this is a pretty perennial, I don't want to impose some kind of false universal, but feathered serpents
Yeah.
as beings that mediate the traversal between worlds. And, we've talked a little bit about this probably in the Jungian context. They mediate this katabatic thing. So Hermes obviously is the psychopomp, that leads the dead to the underworld. But feathered serpents are very big in Mesoamerican mythology. And again, it's a creature, the feathers, a creature of the heavens, the snake, a creature of like a chthonic creature. But the staff of Asclepius, or rod of Asclepius, that's a very prevalent, that's the World Health Organization's logo still today. That's a very prevalent image associated with medicine. And that's also a snake climbing up a staff. And then in India, there's a lot of snakes.
Kundalini, of course, with the
Yeah.
the serpent, that's the image to represent this chakra system and the raising of spiritual energy and all of that.
Yeah, so a kind of awakening, right? And certainly there's a lot of snake worship in different parts of India, including in this state Karnataka, where I've just visited. But different snakes might be treated differently in different communities as well. There's going to be a lot of local heterogeneity with I mean, India is just such a diverse place anyway. But even in a given community, a king cobra might be treated very differently from a common cobra or from a Russell's viper. Like king cobras almost never bite anyone. They are incredibly, this is the world's largest venomous snake. They're incredibly imposing snakes. Their generic name, their genus is Ophiophagus, which means snake eating, because they almost exclusively feed on other snakes. They also eat monitor lizards. So they might be seen as a kind of guardian deity that keeps things like common cobras and Russell's vipers and those snakes, which are actually more likely to bite people, under control. And they're just something that inspires respect. When you see a king cobra, it feels like, and I mean, I might be prone to some kind of anthropomorphizing or almost like, it has been essentially a spiritual experience for me every time I've seen a wild king cobra, but they do stop when they notice you and they look at you. And like a lot of snakes, when they see you, for example, the tiger snakes that I encounter very regularly at this time of year around here, they'll usually move away very quickly. They're like, whoa, I don't want to be near that. But a king cobra is one of those snakes that looks at you and you kind of feel like, again, there's maybe a lot of projection going on here, but that they're taking your measure. And then they kind of cruise off. They're like, yeah, we're all good, and they just cruise off. Like it takes quite a lot to rile them up, especially large king cobras. You really have to be working hard to upset them. They have a kind of calmness about them, which I think comes from just being, pretty much an apex predator.
Right.
But yeah, so people are going to respond very differently to different snakes in their environment, and for obvious reasons. And that could just be as prosaic as in Australia, in many places where their pythons are common, people are quite happy to have pythons in and around the home, living in the roof or whatever. People perceive them as controlling rats. But if there's a brown snake which similarly eats rats, cruising around in the garden, people tend to freak out. And one of the big messages that that Jerry Martin, the guy who runs, along with his wife Chandani, the Liana Trust, which I've just been visiting and working with, is that we're obviously not going to get rid of snakes, and snakes do provide all these ecosystem services, including keeping down pest numbers. And so learning to live alongside them is the important thing. And there is a relatively new to India culture of snake removal, which they call snake rescue. And similarly in Australia and in the US and all this is very common, but Jerry thinks it's very much a Western thing that was imported to India. Like people just used to live alongside snakes, and maybe they would kill them, or maybe they would just try to encourage them to leave. But this, we will call a professional, an expert to come and remove it thing is relatively recent addition to the culture over there. Jerry thinks that that's very pointless because, if you live in an area where there are snakes, you've got a lot more snakes around than the snakes that you're seeing. And it's also ecologically very problematic to take a snake from one place and put it somewhere else. So framing it as kind of snake rescue, and certainly the Serpamitra, as they're called in India, which means snake lover, people that do this job for sure, believe they have the snake's best interests in mind, but you're obviously, you're introducing a snake from some other habitat, and we don't know a lot about how they navigate within their home ranges, the scent trails they're familiar with, the environmental features they're familiar with, and all of that. Introducing it to another habitat, which might also already be at carrying capacity for snakes occupying that niche. So there's some kind of displacement going on. And all the evidence that we do have suggests that snakes generally do very poorly when they are relocated. But so it's a matter of learning to live alongside things, and Jerry will tell very interesting stories about the recent phenomenon of the human leopard conflict, for example. Like leopards are very common in India in suburban and even urban areas, and again it's something that people have been living alongside for a long time. But only a few decades ago they started these programs of removing leopards from areas where they were seen to be a potential problem. And there is again, it's not super well substantiated, but there is the hypothesis that leopards have actually become more of a real problem, like are more likely to be killing people's dogs and livestock and other things in this post-translocation era. because when you move a leopard from where, the environment that it's very familiar with, and it, knows where to go to ambush its prey and blah, 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 it's disoriented, it's somewhat panicked, and it will just go for whatever seems easy under those circumstances. And that's the kind of thing that brings them into conflict with humans.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
Do it then a hard segue onto Reiner Schürmann.
We better.
Yeah. Well, we can talk about whatever, but this is a really interesting paper.
Yeah.
What he says in the second paragraph, which you've sort of referenced. Well, he already says in the first paragraph, our 20th century may furthermore place us in the peculiar position where reflecting upon the historical situatedness of our reasoned convictions has become a major element of the philosophical endeavor itself. And, this is kind of obvious with the rise of historicism. I mean, it's not a 20th century thing, but the rise of historicism, etc. And then he says, and so bringing this context specificity thing, which I take, a lot of the paper is really about, even though we should say, this paper is titled Neoplatonic Henology as an Overcoming of Metaphysics, which might sound incredibly esoteric, and there is obviously an esoteric aspect to it, but really it's context specificity is one of the predominant themes. He says,
and this was written just in the 80s or
yes, I think this is in the 80s. Yeah,
in the 80s. Okay. Yeah.
Whoever sets out to do, I mean, he died in 93. I think he did do a lot in the 80s. So, and certainly he's referencing Margins of Philosophy by Derrida, which the 1982 translation. So anyway, probably should have looked that up. Yeah, the exact year that it was published. But whoever sets out to do philosophy, whether in the Middle Ages or today, places himself, within a lineage. He is situated diachronically, but he is also situated synchronically. He places himself within a cultural network of exchanges. Okay, for me, right, what I find really fascinating about reading stuff like this, and to be honest, a lot of things, and it still remains to be proven that I'm not a crazy person, but it's the shared thought forms that we find in apparently very disparate modes of investigation and thought, right? Disciplines, So what's he saying? You're in a lineage and you're also situated synchronically. So how do I define evolution and ecology, right? Evolution is diachronic relationality, so being within a lineage, and ecology is synchronic relationality, being in a particular context. And this whole paper is about that. This whole paper is about these epochal contexts, which, arise and are fixed at a certain point and then recede, are dissolved at another point, and then another context emerges. These epochal contexts that constrain thought and action in particular periods of cultural evolution. But yeah, the thought form is exactly the same here. This is the same way that we would think about, biological evolution. And why I like Schürmann, and I guess why I've sort of introduced him to our dialogue, is that he is someone who is explicitly thinking about ontological anarchy, right? So he's thinking about what is really, I mean, it's very Heraclitean ultimately, perhaps, but that would be to trivialize it. But what is really invariant is variation, is change, is this process of the fixation of a set of norms, of an epochal stamp that is a reference frame for a particular period of thought and action, etc. So the arising of them, the territorializing, let's say, and the deterritorializing, the dissolution of such frames. And that's what's constant. And thus, he characterizes the philosopher through much of this. So he follows Heidegger in saying, like, the history of philosophy / the history of metaphysics is like Plato to now, in some, to like the contemporary era, when it's coming to an end, the end of philosophy or the overcoming of metaphysics. And so the pre-Socratics are seen as somewhat different, but the philosopher, for the most part, obviously we're talking about a Western tradition here, Western with all the problematic scare quotes that should have as well. But the role of the philosopher has been as a kind of civil servant whose job was to discover, describe, install, so create ultimately, but apparently discover the anchorage, the basically the arche, but the principles of organization of a particular epoch that would enable a particular culture or society. And he does kind of hint at this term culture and society in a way that I think we could draw very strong parallels to Whitehead. It's an ecological context or an ecological assemblage, perhaps at any scale. But discovering the epochal stamp, the reference frame, the principles that ground, action and thought within any given context, so that the society or the culture can cohere around that attractor, basically, right? So if you're thinking in free energy principle terms, this is the derivation of the non-equilibrium steady state for cultures at large on particular periods, but the artificial or fictitious elevation of them to eternal, the hypostasization, reification, blah, 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 of them as eternal as opposed to epochal. And so the modern thought, which is also an archaic thought, but the modern thought that he's elaborating from Heidegger is basically the dissolution of these things and the dissolution of the transcendent in a certain sense, right? And we should get to that when we talk about the bit about Plotinus. But yeah, so the emptying, the releasement, then is the overcoming of metaphysics. So he sees the Neoplatonic Henologists, and then he talks about Meister Eckhart, who, Schürmann was a Dominican priest when he was young, right? And so before he actually became a full-time philosopher, he was essentially a theologian, and he did a lot of his early work on Meister Eckhart, and he writes really beautifully about Eckhart, actually, in a number of places. His first book, what is it, Wandering Grace? Yeah, can't remember. Anyway, about Eckhart. So yeah, that's why I think he's really relevant to us, because I think if we're taking this sort of process relational, evolutionary, ecological, blah, 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 form of thought to the hilt, this is the kind of vision that we end up with as it pertains to the practice of philosophy itself.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the focus on historical epochs and the lack of any transcendent or kind of eternal foundation is important. And a short way of capturing this is just to say that philosophy is the history of philosophy. I love Goethe says that about science. He says science is the history of science. I think at least continental philosophers have caught on to the importance of historically contextualizing philosophy. And it would be helpful, I think, if science also took on this historical understanding. And certainly science has pushed an understanding of natural history and, undermined the overly pre-formationist understanding of nature in prior centuries. But what's interesting in terms of just the emphasis on epochs here, and really a shift from not just doing a history of ideas where we think of prior periods of history as just people just had different concepts or something, but really more what I would call an evolution of consciousness, where we're recognizing that the whole perceptual gestalt changes, the way that phenomena appear is transforming over the course of history, not just the way that we talk about or represent conceptually what's happening, but the very perceptual gestalt is shifting. But this was written, it was written in 83, actually. I just looked it up. And so we're talking about, 40 years ago. And you could say, I mean, he calls it the atomic age when he refers to the present in which he is writing. The wall wouldn't fall for another 6 years. And while obviously we're still threatened by nuclear war, perhaps we're closer to that today or as of a few days ago than we have been in quite some time. And so we're not out of the danger of that. But I think we've also had to contend with information warfare in a way that was just beginning to manifest in the 80s. I mean, it was still newspapers and televisions back then. And now we have the internet, we have social media, we have total information war. I mean, you could call ours the information age or the disinformation age, which again hasn't done away with the threat of self-annihilation via nuclear weapons or just via technology generally. That's still the theme, but I think we're in a somewhat new situation now that's even more hyper real, to use Adam Curtis's term, or maybe he's taking that from Baudrillard. Um, but we're in a situation now where there's so much mediation and representation that uh, stands between us and contact with the anarchy of reality that I think there is some sense in which this paper is dated, but on the other hand, you know, we're still dealing with a situation where we're encountering nihilism and the failure of these various projects of transcendence and foundationalism, and um, we're still in a situation where we're having to learn to swim without our floaties in a way, like and to acknowledge the groundlessness of our own knowledge. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so in that sense, it's still timely. Um, but I it's hard to know where to start with this paper because literally on the first page with a paragraph and a half and that one line from Derrida, I have the whole of the margins of the page are filled up with my notes. Um, and I think, I think Schürmann is helpfully, he's acknowledging Derrida as in a sense like an inheritor of Heidegger and the critique and deconstruction of Western metaphysics, but he's also trying to slow down a little bit. And they're already, in that very line from Derrida that he starts with, he says, in the margins of philosophy, the closure of metaphysics, which some audacities in the Enneads seem to indicate by transgressing it, dot, dot, dot. And so Derrida is already acknowledging that Plotinus, in a way, undermines any closure that you might think or foundationalism that you might imagine is present in his scheme.
Mm-hmm.
Even though in that book, Derrida is really, leaning into his critique, not only of Plotinus, I think he just barely touches on Plotinus, if I recall, but more on the whole tradition of privileging a unity and presence and self-identity, hierarchy. Plotinus privileges speech over writing, and Derrida's not happy about that. And just this whole idea that the one could be misinterpreted, and I think it would be a misinterpretation of Plotinus, of Eckhart. It would be a misinterpretation of Gregory of Nyssa, of the whole negative theological tradition, though I know in that way of rendering what one might mean by the one, what Plotinus means by the one, the implication is that, oh, well, that's God. We just, like Aquinas would say, and this is mentioned in a footnote, um, we cannot know what God is, but here's the science of God. I'll lay it out for you. And Aquinas is a reader of Dionysius the Areopagite and is aware of mystical theology and how we can't just rush into these analogies without being careful. But then Eckhart has a way of really radicalizing the analogy between the creature and the creator, but in a way that pulls the ground out from under us. And in Eckhart, you might, in this whole Western metaphysical tradition, with any degree of inheritance of this negative theology tradition, is going to be aware of the Abgrund, this term that Eckhart uses that Jakob Böhme picks up on later, and it becomes very important for the German idealists, that the groundlessness. You might be tempted to think that, oh, Eckhart's basically saying the structure of thought mirrors the structure of being, and so we can, through analogy, reach an understanding of God or identify ourselves with God through a kind of partial participation. But I think what Eckhart is really saying is that thought or the soul has a kind of nothingness inside of it, a kind of emptiness or a kind of groundlessness. And it's precisely in that groundlessness that we find our likeness
Yeah.
with Godhead, not with God as a thing among things, or even God as being as a noun, but this ongoing process, something more akin to Whitehead's creativity, right? That is what we share, what the soul shares at its core with the divine. And so, in that sense, there is a way in which there's a mirroring here, but it's a mirroring precisely in the anarchist, uh, groundless nothingness. And yeah, just to wrap this thread up, and curious to hear your reflections on all of that. But in our current, and this has maybe been the last 150 years. I mean, Nietzsche probably is the one who first recognizes this, and we're still catching up. That God is dead, and the transcendent ground of our sense of the source of morality and the source of our human social and political forms of order, like all of this, just the bottom has dropped out of it, and we need to reconstruct that somehow. But we're faced with this nothingness, and we can have this pessimistic or optimistic response to the nothingness, or maybe I don't know if that's quite the right way to say it. We can despair in the face of that nothingness, or we can treat this as an opportunity for a grand constructive project where out of the nothingness comes a kind of artistic and creative renewal,
Openness of the future, right?
openness of the future. Yeah, exactly.
The responsibility that might confer,
Yeah.
which might be one reason to recoil. No,
Mm.
I think yeah, you've got to the essence, the anti-essential essence of all of this, and the nothingness is to be cute in a way that many people are, is the no thingness, right? Is the non-objecthood of the ground, and that's what makes it groundless. So it's kind of not so much a void. I mean, you could refer to it as a void, but it is an active principle, right? It's a pure activity from which determinate objects arise. And I think the process of, is not the term that Schürmann uses, but the process of actualization, which is described in terms of the setting of the contingent epochal foundations, is a setting of a reference frame into which other entities or objects can come, not pre-constituted objects that then come to take up a place of relation within a reference frame, but an active principle that is constrained by a particular reference frame, and that is the precondition of the formation of determinate objects. And I think there's a lot of ways we can, connect that to, everything from Whitehead to system science more broadly, and obviously the FEP. But, I think you are, really getting to the core of it there. And so one of the things to talk about is the status of analogy, and Schürmann does describe Eckhart as radicalizing the Aristotelian analogy. And the Aristotelian analogy is one of resemblance, of sort of representation or mirroring, like you said. I mean, you said there's still a mirroring, but we can slightly problematize that, in that mirroring partakes of that, visual resemblance, or representational resemblance. What is in the mirror?
Yeah. There's a resonance perhaps instead of a mirroring.
Yeah. But even let's just keep drilling down, because even then, it sounds like there's a structure. There are two things that are in resonance with each other because of some, sympathy, some structural qualities that they have, which bring them into this resonant relationship with each other. And I want to bring Simondon in here, because I think Simondon is one of the great sort of modern, like contemporary, well, it's before Schürmann, right? But 20th century theorists of the analogy, and he is basically saying, this radicalization of analogy is, it's a movement beyond resemblance and representation to operation, right? So allegmatics is the operational analogy, and at its limit, that is the partaking in, the sharing in the active principle, which is the groundless ground in this case. So we're beyond objects that resemble, we're beyond structures that resemble each other. And this is like the big move, obviously, for these 20th century guys. The move into post-structuralism, obviously kind of christened by Derrida, but the movement from structures which are relatively static, forms that can resemble each other, to these active, and Deleuze and Guattari will say, machinic. And so, Guattari has this essay, Machine and Structure, which, inaugurates his relationship to Deleuze, and, the machinic assemblages, which are arising as canalizers, as assemblages of junctions that are canalizing flows, but arising and receding, not actually fixed, and importantly, immanent to those flows, constitute, like canalizing the flow, but also constituted by the flow in the manner of a dissipative structure in the sort of non-equilibrium thermodynamics lineage, which, as we know, Deleuze and Guattari were themselves actually influential on the development of that thought. But so where I would then push that, and I want to get to something that's a little bit before this radicalizing of the analogy, which is the status of transcendence in the stuff that the quote from Plotinus. But if we're moving beyond objects that resemble, beyond structures that resemble, to this shared partaking in an active groundless ground or principle, we also want to move beyond what I think, and this is what you're getting at with Nietzsche and the death of God, the radical theocentrism still of Eckhart, because Eckhart still, it's still ultimately, it's not about God, the being anymore. I mean, God the being is still a feature of his system, but is a secondary feature in relation to the Godhead. But there's still this analogy there, which indicates that the being of beings is not their own, as I think Schürmann says something like that. It's God's, or it's the Godheads. And there's a bit of a contradiction there, and maybe it's just partly in the way that Schürmann is spelling it out, even though he's very good on this in his other writings on Eckhart. A big part of releasement, this process, which Schürmann will describe as preparatory, and I think we'll get to that as well, preparatory to some kind of effective action, perhaps. But releasement is about, it's renunciation, as they would say in a more, in an Indian context, you talk about. And as a non-thing, the Godhead itself can't possess anything, right? So there's no ownership. So you can't say that beings, they're no longer these resembling God by, this structural resemblance, which they are in a sense borrowing. So they are simulacra in a sense, right? That mirror, but can never rise to the form of whatever it is, any given form, but ultimately, God. Really, you can't say that God owns anything, right? Or the Godhead, like the fundamental active principle, is not the kind of thing. It's not a thing, so it can't possess things. It's precisely defined by the absence of possession or ownership, because it is in a I don't want to say space. It's in a mode. And I think mode maybe is an important way of putting it, to get away from transcendence, which I'll finish with a quick note on that. But it's in a mode that is, adjacent to, orthogonal to, actually would be a better way of putting it, objecthood. And so again, there's no ownership where there are no objects. And so when Plotinus talks about transcendence, and Porphyry famously talks about the several times that Plotinus achieved transcendence during Porphyry's time with him, and through, what does he say, like through the pure act or something. So it's an active thing that it wasn't because he had some disposition for achieving transcendence and it just happened to him spontaneously. It's like it's a practice. So he practiced to achieve it and he was able to achieve it these few times. But Plotinus talks about transcendence, right? And there is this language of transcendence. And I think maybe in the contemporary context, that's something we do want to get beyond. And I think we even want to go beyond the transcendental. And maybe
beyond.
Yeah, well, cool. So yeah, that's exactly what I want to problematize. So I've put my foot in it. But we think of transcending to something that's beyond or above or beneath, right? But really, if we're thinking in this Persian way that we've talked about before, and we're thinking, or just in any aspectual or perspectival way, there's no like hierarchical relationship between these modes of relating and these different kinds of mediation, we might say, right? And there might be here an image of there being a lack of mediation altogether. We might want to problematize that too. But I would prefer to say, rather than beyond or beneath or above, like transcending, just beside, you're occupying a different position, you're using a different kind of reference frame, the reference frame of no reference frame to some degree, if it's fully anarchic, but to look at a different aspect of reality, just like, seeing things as substances and seeing things as processes. It's not that there aren't substances. It's not that there aren't structures. We don't want to go into that deeply anti-realist place where we're like, oh, well, it turns out the structures are dynamic, so there are no structures. It's looking at things in a different way. And so in the Persian sense, like in the world of secondness, and there is a reference to crystallization later on in this essay, but in the world of secondness, that is kind of the world of structures that are like, bumping into each other. But we can step, maybe I prefer a depth model, in some way to a model of transcendence, but that's just inverting the thing. We can step sideways, like all the spatial metaphors are obviously just metaphors, but we can suspend our conceptual grasping of the world. We can suspend that process, and then we become, I keep wanting to say immersed, but that's clearly, secondary to a depth model, but we become, present to the immanent, like we are just with what is immanent. And so what we're kind of transcending is the pseudo-transcendent, because these conceptual frameworks, they erect themselves as kind of over and above what's going on, the stream of, or the blooming, buzzing confusion or whatever. But this is a false appearance. So to say that we are transcending is to be buying into the logic of that false appearance, really. The false appearance of inframings, of epochal stamps, etc., which sees them as standing above or beneath, as God or ground phenomena. That's not what we're doing. We're occupying a different position in relation to phenomena, and then being more focused on, their arising, their impermanence and their interdependence and all of those things in the Buddhist context, rather than getting stuck on the structural analogy, which I don't know. I don't think we want to do, like Deleuze, for example, wants to completely do away with that, right? Do away with that whole Aristotelian tradition of analogy and its attendant holomorphism and all of that. I mean, it's still a way of thinking. We just want to, and it might be useful, but we don't want it to be transcendent. We don't want it to be ultimate. We want to see that there are other ways of seeing the world. But I do always kind of worry, and I worry about this tendency in myself, of just installing another ultimate with a capital U, even if that ultimate is process. I don't know.
Yeah, no, lots of good stuff there. I think there's a way of reading Plotinus, and all we can do, as Schürmann notes, is read him from the present, retrospectively. And there's a deconstructive reading of Plotinus as really putting forward what Derrida means by the trace, which is, I think, evident in, again, a way of reading emanation and the overflowing of meaning that Plotinus is describing as he moves through these degrees of being. And yes, there's a kind of hierarchy here, and yet I think it's a hierarchy that he's questioning in the sense that there is an emanation out, and then or an involution, you might say, and then there's a return. And so I think even in Plotinus's account of his mystical experiences, which Porphyry says there were 4 times, and he says several times, um, there's a questioning that it raises questions for him. It doesn't give him answers. And, everybody, well, people tend to, maybe rightly criticize or be worried about the way in which Plotinus really denies the body and wants to escape the body. And he seems to have had some really difficult digestion issues. And so maybe we can cut him some slack and say his body was not very nice to him.
Compare Nietzsche.
And Nietzsche, right?
The opposite.
Who affirmed, yeah, for sure. But
it's having like incredible migraines and digestion issues and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I mean, I'm with you.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah, I'm not trying to absolve the criticism by pointing this out. I'm just saying it is a problem in Plotinus, really. But he does say, while he refers to the slumber of the body and the need to escape that to become self and centered, it's not just that we need to transcend the body; we also need to transcend the mind. The what's translated here as reasoning. He says there comes a moment of descent from intellection to reasoning, and I think that's from noesis to dianoia, to use the terms that Plato develops in the Republic, where noesis would be identification with and sort of intuitive merger with the object of knowledge, so that there is no distinction anymore between subject and object, whereas dianoia would be more of the traditional relationship between a mind having ideas about an object. And so it's important to note that he's not just denying the body in this move of transcendence, he's denying the mind as well. And when we talk about transcendence in the context of Plotinus, it's also important to note the distinction he makes between the one within and the one itself, the one within the soul. And so it's a movement of transcendence, but an interiorization as well. And so there's always this double movement, I feel like, in what Plotinus is describing here. It's a deepening into ourselves as much as it is a transcendence into and a return to the one. And of course, it's impossible not to consider here, the work of people like George Lakoff and embodied understanding of the source of metaphor that structures our thinking or informs our thinking, and this whole up down mode of thought. And do we want to knowing that we cannot escape metaphor, is the point here really to say, oh no, these metaphors are bad, let's do left right instead? I feel like it's more about holding the tension. Descent is just as important for Plotinus as ascent. He says, he ends this little reflection that Schürmann quotes by saying, after that sojourn into the divine, I ask myself how it happens that I can now be descending, and how the soul ever entered into my body. And so this experience evokes and provokes in Plotinus a reflection on like this question, what are the conditions of the possibility of embodied consciousness? And so he's making, I would say here, more of a transcendental move in the Kantian sense than simply transcendent move. I mean, he comes back down from this high, and then he's trying to integrate with the fact that, oh, I am an embodied soul. How did I get here? And I think that shows us that, like, on some level, paradoxically, the way up and the way down are there's a kind of lemniscate going on here. The one infinite, and matter is also infinite, sort of undefinable, empty of form, right? Beyond form. And so there's a strange correspondence. Well, that's not the right word. There's a strange um, indecipherability
Yeah.
between the one and matter. The supposedly highest and lowest in some ways coincide.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I love that. And of course, it goes, that's Heraclitus that you sort of
Yeah.
quickly quoted there. The way up and the way down are the same. Um, of course, you can talk about the unity of opposites in dialectical thought, and I think we want to avoid, though, reducing all of the complexity of what you were just articulating, and the complexity of the way or actually the humility of the way that someone like Plotinus is sort of feeling his way through it, as opposed, but that's not necessarily the way Plotinus is always received, right? So
Oh yeah.
sometimes we use metaphors and then others reify them, or there's perhaps a tendency that we have in different states of consciousness. So when he's very close to that whole experience, he's in the uncertainty, in the kind of instability of that experience. But perhaps on other occasions, and we all do that. So there's nothing against Plotinus. And I don't think we want to replace, to your point, up down with side to side or something like that. I mean, I think we want to just, by proliferating metaphors in these areas where we really aren't talking about things in terms of like spatial extension and whatever, but we are, beholden to spatial metaphors, we're just problematizing all the metaphors. We're just saying, look, just remember, because there's too easy, perhaps, a way back to metaphysics, in the sense that it's characterized here, like when we're going up or down, God is above, ground is below. It becomes too easy to engage in that kind of, looking for an anchor, looking for a center, another spatial metaphor, and then seizing, phenomena from that perspective. And again, not that we are not bound to do that. We need to have a reference frame. It's like determining what is relevant and what is irrelevant. There's a strong, obviously, relationship to relevance realization here. There's a strong relevance to just information theory in general. How are we going to determine what is in fact information and what is in fact noise? And cells are in this sea of ambiguous information, and they need to make these sorts of judgments. They need to stipulate reference frames in order to be able to act effectively in the world. And I think there's a story we can tell about all that from this perspective as well. But just, again, we just want to be problematizing any given reference frame by drawing our attention back to the process of the constitution of reference frame as itself a phenomenon, which is, again, this phenomenological approach that Heidegger and Schürmann are developing here. And we also really want to problematize this approach, especially, well, given the obvious, which is always lurking, the elephant in the room whenever we're talking about Heidegger, and wanting to
I was going to say his characterization of Heidegger helping us avoid the violence of technology. I was like, maybe in word, but in
yeah,
political deed, I'm not sure.
that is something that Schürmann grapples with in his big book on Heidegger, from on being, what is it? On being and acting, from principles to anarchy, and also I think in his fictitious memoir Origins. But so that's something to get to, maybe, which is the association of this notion of perhaps releasement, and of letting things reveal themselves in an autonomous fashion, with a kind of authentic relationship to phenomena, or to the world. And then the question does arise, just as a matter of biographical concern with someone like Heidegger, who gets to, who has the capacity to enter into this kind of authentic relationship. And Schürmann does say at one point in here that it's like, it's not only the intellectuals, And probably Heidegger would agree with that in the sense that it might be the Volk, but Heidegger has a radically parochial understanding of who, or at least he did at a certain very pivotal point in his life, of who is actually capable of entering into that. And I mean, you'd need to be speaking German at the very least, as far as Heidegger is concerned. So
Yeah, and I mean, and as we've discussed with like Jung and Freud and things that Jung said that were just part of how ethnic Germans would think about Jews living among them. A word like intellectual is code, for the uprooted, more cosmopolitan Jewish population. And so I think I don't want to overly insist on that sort of interpretation and get conspiratorial about it, but at the same time, these tropes do proliferate and have had certain effects in the 20th, did have certain effects in the 20th century that I think should at least make us cautious about this attempt to recover authenticity, because when you start to tie that to blood and soil, things get violent really, really quickly.
get very, very ugly. But I think it's also important not, and I know you would agree, but not to simply, like, to the extent that we find some of this thought attractive, and then one learns, recognizes, whatever, that one of the great thinkers of this kind of thought was a card carrying Nazi, and a thoroughgoing anti-Semite. Not to immediately just turn our backs on the thought, because firstly, it's an ancient form of thought, which again is neither here nor there in terms of its value. But it doesn't belong to that person. But also, it becomes very important to try and understand the associations between this kind of thinking and that, it's an abhorrent real world outcome. And
Right.
it, like, how can someone who seems to have such highly differentiated thought and to be thinking, very similar things to Whitehead in a lot of ways, you can say, right? How can someone who's having that kind of thought end up in the place that Heidegger did in terms of personal beliefs and personal actions? And it is quite important for us to try and understand that, to the extent that we want to think similar thoughts.
More important to study Heidegger than it otherwise even would be, because of this particular connection. So I don't agree with those who would say, oh, we shouldn't study Heidegger because of this shadow dimension, or this Nazi stain on his thought. I think it means it's all the more important to study Heidegger.
And similarly, boycotting vitalism, or boycotting, narrative, boycotting mythology, all of that.
Well, I just like to remind people, like, a great example of how a more analytical mode of thought that you might think would prevent you from falling prey to fascism or whatever, the darker side of romanticism. Like, look at Frege. He was a Nazi apologist too. I mean, he was defending a fascist view of the proper way to organize Germany, even though he was also one of the initiators of the Logicist project and all of that. And so even the most analytic thinkers can succumb to this. It's not just a function of these romantics trying to recover a connection to the mythic dimension of our souls or whatever.
And of course, the argument that the romantics would make, or Heidegger would make, is that, of course, the analytic types would be the first to do this, because their whole thought world is predicated on the grasping and on the projective violation of autonomy by trying to get beings, entities, objects to be neat and tidy and to fit into little categorical, conceptually defined boxes. And that's the kind of violence that Schürmann is talking about here. Yeah. Okay, so to get onto that sort of topic, and the topic of sort of ownership, I suppose, one of the things that is said in this discussion of Eckhart and Augustine is brought up, but this analogical mode where we are identifying with God or Godhead, And, in Augustine's words, God is more intimate to me than I am to myself. And, how should we think about that in this kind of framing? And I think, with this extension, with this radicalization of analogy from resemblance to operation, again, what's more intimate to me than myself is the activity, or really just lived experience, right? The activity of living, and our experience. And myself, or like I, or like Tim, or whatever, is a position in the symbolic order, right? Is an object that I conceptualize, that others also conceptualize, and I partake in that reciprocal interdependent conceptualization of myself. It becomes an object that I identify with. Obviously, in psychoanalytic terms, it's the ego object. And God, or Godhead, is then, as this active principle. And again, there are reasons why I will not personally use those terms, but it's more intimate to me than myself, because it is not the object that I fictitiously identify with, that I project, and that acts as this kind of dissipative structure in my psyche, within consciousness. But what is my own then, in this way of thinking, Eigentlichkeit, as in Heideggerese, is in fact the locus of autonomy, right? That is conferred by my partaking in, and always already partaking in, right? It's something that I might not be attending to, but to the extent that I'm an agent, I am partaking in it. And of course, part of the emptying, part of the releasement, and part of the clearing away of the conceptual baggage that gets between us and the thing, in these terms, is about escaping the constraints of my epoch, conceptual constraints of my epoch, of opinion, not simply moving with the crowd and all of that, and so becoming more autonomous. But that's what is my own. But again, it's in the logic of non-ownership, so it's problematic to say that it is mine in any sense. But it's my locus of autonomy, the locus of autonomy that my body occupies. So my sparse coupling, my conditional independence, my excess of any reference frame greater than myself. But it's then important, because this can become this, it's an autopoietic view here. And of course, Heidegger is big for that lineage of thinking. It's just important to note, again, not that autopoietic theorists can't admit of this or haven't theorized it, but even within what I would then claim as my own, like within this locus of embodied agency, which, roughly speaking, is my body, there's also, in Deleuze's terms, the body without organs. So this is itself a reference frame then, even, my embodied my body, right, is a reference frame. And within that, there's still all this uncanalized activity, from holobiont to stochastic gene expression and everything else, right, that is not assimilated or not pre-assimilated to my locus of agency, to the extent that we can.
Not to mention your own mortality and your death, which you can't possibly sort of own.
Yeah.
But the kind of ownership I think Heidegger is talking about, and maybe in our sort of Anglo context, ownership just has different connotations than what he means, when he uses a term like eigen in German, because it just to us smells more like an ego having and possessing something. But when you bring that into when you bring that into dialogue with what he talks about in terms of our being towards death, which is, death is in some sense always my own, in the sense that nobody else can do it for me. And we each have a unique relationship to that, to our death, that, we experience other people dying, but that's very different from our own confrontation with that, which isn't a closure so much as an opening. And so it's almost like, with Heidegger's emphasis on appropriation and making this one's own, he's he's pointing out the way in which like the way to a kind of concrete universal, to use a Hegelian term, is through the unique. Like in order to arrive at this in order for being to become unconcealed, you can't get it through a general formula. You can't get it from conceptual thinking. You get it from encountering death in the unique way that only you can, your death. And I think that's where there's a kind of negative theology at work in Heidegger's thought, because whatever the one might be, it's going to be something we can only something we encounter through meditative thinking, not through conceptual understanding. And that means because there's not a concept for it, we can't really effectively communicate about it to anyone.
And I
Right.
think that the being towards death is a kind of, an anchor again for a practice, because this is a
Mhm.
big thing, right? We're all living in the shadow of it, or it's all going to happen to us all, But the extension of that practice then, and it is a demystification of it, and it is why I like to say the prosaic,
Yeah.
is that when we are really engaged, when we are really encountering this death. We've talked about psychic catabasis in the Jungian context, but you think about the Buddhist way of talking about this, it's just happening all the time, like, and obviously this is Whitehead's perpetual perishing, the phenomenological correlate of that. Well, I don't know if you'd sign up for that, but a way of thinking about it, the thing is the moment.
It's the ontological correlate of what Heidegger is describing phenomenologically, I would say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you just want to give a Whitehead priority in the way that we frame.
Well, no, not necessarily. I don't know that Whitehead does phenomenology at
Yeah.
all, or if he tries, it's not as deep as Heidegger's.
Yeah. But I mean, I want to move beyond even Heidegger and just to this general contemplative. But it's not, the thing is, when we talk about the contemplative, and again, there are reasons we need to problematize the contemplative watching, because the way that becomes like the letting the things reveal themselves and all of that. This has been argued about in the Vedic tradition for thousands of years, or
Which, by the way, the Upanishads got scooped all of us on negative theology,
yeah,
with
but
Neti.
also the satirizing of the apathy that can emerge from simply feeling like, and this is why transcendence again is a problematic image, because when transcendence is related to kind of the stoic view from above, like you transcend and you become aloof and you look down and you're dissociated, and things don't touch you at that point. And that might be very important to cultivate that kind of practice. It's therapeutic. It could also be preparatory in the sense that's discussed here, but preparatory for what? That's not necessarily really articulated in this paper. We're letting things reveal themselves. We're not interfering. We're then also cultivating the clear light and all of that. So we're not, our capacity to understand what's going on is not radically determined by our affects and all of these things, or by the body, and that's we can get into that problematic aspect as well. That can be really useful, but it's not a complete philosophy, and it's certainly not a complete mode of engagement with the world. And the truth perhaps also is that people who are just out there in the world, in environments which are very rich, there are many things going on, and maybe we can talk about organisms more broadly that have to have to embed themselves in their environments, use all the resources that they have, all of the channels of sensory engagement that they have to be attuned so that they are most effectively acquiring the sufficient statistics of their embedding environment, because they have to be responding to affordances all of the time. And we get into this problem when we are when we become alienated, perhaps, and maybe language is part of that, and that's part of the argument that's being made here again, these conceptual trappings that get between us and the world. But then we tend to kind of mystify and glorify the whole thing by saying, oh, well, then we have to transcend all of that and get to this. And it's like, well, maybe you're just being more like a bog standard organism at that time. And maybe the insight that emerges and the uniquely human spin on it and everything is indeed the oscillation, is that katabatic movement. That's why the human is the feathered serpent, right? That moves between realms, isn't just chthonic or isn't just of the heavens or whatever. It's the oscillatory movement that generates a certain kind of insight. But nonetheless, it's perhaps not the ideal thing to do to glorify and mystify that, when in fact it's kind of intellectuals, and in Jungian terms, it's people who have kind of, intellect as a primary function of their personality that become alienated in the first place and then develop these doctrines of transcendence and blah, blah, blah. Whereas just being more like the animal that you in fact are by being present in and engaged with your, life world is really what we're talking about in some sense, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing like mystical or what. I mean, these terms all have various valences, but that's just really prosaic. That's why I like saying it that way.
I think when we are still assuming a substance ontology here, contemplation is often rendered as this kind of neutral witnessing, observing, escapist sort of move. But if you read someone like Bergson, contemplation is quite active, and it's the word that he likes to use, and he's drawing on Plotinus here, who says all things contemplate. For Bergson, the contemplation is how we come to attune to the rhythm of the elan vital, how we become attuned to the animacy of the world. And yes, it's not any more action oriented in the way that the instrumental intellect would be, and that it's seeking to find useful ways of manipulating the world around us. And so contemplation is not active in that sense, but it is active in the sense that for Bergson, it's getting to the root of things beneath the mechanical appearance that the intellect produces when it tries to represent everything in terms of these fixed concepts that are useful. What was that?
That it's radical, getting to the root, right? Radical.
Yes. Yeah. So just on, in defense of contemplation in Bergson's sense, and again in Plotinus's sense, because he's very much in that lineage, I think we don't necessarily need to read it as just about withdrawing and observing as if from outside. But and I love the way that Schürmann highlights how Eckhart, still working with these Aristotelian categories of substance and accident or substance and property, ends up kind of falling back from the radicality of his insight into the one beyond being by saying, only God is, or being is God, and that creatures are just nothing. Hey, Philo. Because there, it's like if he stuck with his insight into the Abgrund and the way in which we encounter God, the Godhead, through the groundlessness of our own soul, then being is not read as substance, it's read as activity, right? And so contemplation then similarly is not simply withdraw into the oneness that is above it all, but rather a deepening and interiorization to the point where we become identified with the life of everything, right? So I think it's interesting how sometimes the grammar of our language and of our inherited metaphysics ends up doing our thinking for us, even though that we have these deeper insights whereby we can, in other places in our work, I'm speaking about Eckhart here, overcome that, so he wavers on this point.
Yeah, and maybe he was just trying not to be any more persecuted than he was already going to be.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's just important. I fully agree with all of that, and contemplation not necessarily being kind of inactive or passive, just drawing attention to the fact that that association between contemplation and apathy or inactivity and observation has been articulated and problematized, going back to, as you mentioned, the Upanishads. So it's a real possibility of this way of thinking and this way of talking that just needs to be kind of called out. And, one of the things that Schürmann is saying in this essay is that in our time of contemporary crisis, in the time in which all of the things that have guaranteed meaning, all of the deep anchorages, the epochal stamps are dissolving away, and we're left in this kind of, void or flux, which Plotinus, finds to be likens to identification with the divine and the highest principle and all of that. But a lot of, people also find really terrifying. And maybe, it's good for an individual, but it's difficult when the whole culture is going through this kind of thing, because how do we develop any sense of shared meaning, shared narrative horizon, shared goals to move towards in a coordinated manner and all of that. And Schürmann is saying that, we need to attend to these henologists, who are the only people in the history of Western metaphysics or Western philosophy, according to him, to be anti-metaphysical in this way, because we're in times of crisis. And so it's kind of important that we don't, just that we're specific and explicit about this mode of contemplation not being what I guess Marx would call like contemplative naturalism or contemplative materialism, which is just the watching. And he likens that to the descriptive mode of science, right? It's got to be understood again in those terms, in this dialectical manner, that like whatever we are doing is changing the world, but is changing the conditions of our own ongoing doing. And again, I think active inference actually ends up being potentially a pretty good model here. And so contemplation then, and identification with that activity, but also letting more of the outside in, and being more embedded in our life world, is a preparation for, or an enabling condition of, more effective action, because you are attending to more of the variables, detecting more of the affordances, and that, again, there's a discussion here of it being preparatory to what? Well, at some point you are also going to have to adopt a contingent reference frame, and recognizing it as contingent, recognizing it as subject to revision, going to have to erect some kind of contingent ground that you can, metaphors, blah, 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 you can stand upon, that you can walk forward on, that you can use as a ground for effective action in the world. Otherwise, again, you are simply passive. And sometimes the language here, and even, Schürmann's language when he's describing Heidegger, and maybe not so much in this paper, but in another one, the letting of things reveal, the coming into coherence, so the kind of coherence epistemology or correspondence epistemology that's here. So you're coming into correspondence, you are complying. He even uses that term, like complying with the authentic flux of nature that you're now in contact with and embedded in. And it's like, well, yeah, but this is a obviously from a biological perspective, and oh dear, dirty naturalist reductionism, but for organisms, that compliance, or that again, in even more dirty, model reificatory free energy principle terms, that more efficient acquisition of, and basically the developing of a better model of the sufficient, or the embodiment of a better model of the sufficient statistics of the environment, that is to enable a more effective movement through the environment, not simply to be like, we aren't leaves on a stream, we don't want to smuggle in a kind of crypto determinism here, in my view as well. And that's also been associated, I think, with a lot of contemplative thought. And so even though, yes, amor fati, yes, being worthy of the event that happens to us, things happen and they've happened, and we have to respond to those things. But it's not then a receding to acceptance is not about simply like going with the flow all the time, right? There's obviously a lot of times when we need to go with the flow and not expend a lot of energy uselessly and trying to control things that we can't, like when you're in a taxi in India, for example. Better to just enjoy it rather than be like, freaking out and trying to control things, because it's certainly not up to you to go to India and try and tell someone how to drive. But there are other times when we need to act, obviously, in the world, and I think we just want to be careful that this way of thinking doesn't undermine that, or because again, that can also be a way that Heidegger responds to Nazism on a certain level, like this is happening, and I will be, it's more a Deleuzean term, I suppose, becoming worthy of the event, but I will be worthy of this event, which is greater than me, which is out of my control. This is not necessarily the way Heidegger was thinking. I'm just saying there's another pathway to that kind of mode of engagement, which becomes almost a lack of engagement, like a purely observational thing. I want to get back to the eigen and the eigen form. I was talking for a while there, but just the eigen form is also this term, and there's this really interesting paper on autopoiesis and eigenform. This guy Lewis Kaufman, is the self-similar repeating attractor, basically. The form that. So you can think of homeostasis, homeoresis in these terms, in these autopoietic models. The state that the organism keeps actively, homeoresis, similar flow rather than homeostasis. Keeps actively returning to. And obviously in free energy principle terms, that's the non-equilibrium steady state. But what we also want to talk about, and when we're talking about the broken hegemonies, as Schürmann will say, of these epochal modes, which are hegemonic but then break. And so for Schürmann, the history of philosophy is a history of hegemonies that are then broken. We're also wanting this identification with, this embodying of the active principle, to be the mode through which the novel eigenform, or the novel non-equilibrium steady state, is actually constituted in itself, right? So it's not just that we find a way to be, and that's our eigenform, that's what we own, and we just keep repeating it interminably. It is itself, as Friston would say, a random dynamical system, like it's drifting itself, right? It's always moving, and it's always being adjusted, and there are all these nested, is that a hierarchical model? All these nested temporal scales at which it's being adjusted, and at every temporal scale there is a canalizing solenoidal aspect and a dissipative or Brownian, stochastic aspect, and in a sense the stochasticity above and below any given attractor is always shifting it, providing the resources for it to adapt to any changes in the environment. And of course, again, dialectically, every change that it makes that the agent makes in adapting to the environment is feeding back on the environment and changing the environment, which is just comprised of these processes all over the place, and thus the principle of least action, or the path of least action, keeps changing. Like you're always finding a new way to navigate more, free energy, minimizing, blah blah blah, efficiency. We don't want to go too hard on an optimization model either, but you're always having to continually adjust to create, not just find, but create a new pathway through things.
This is reminding me, and your hesitation about whether this nested sense of the relationality of these biological systems and organisms adapting to environments, I think it reminds me of just the importance of the shift and the difficulty of the shift to a fully relational ontology, where any action taken by an agent changes the arena in which that agent acts, and so feeds back onto the agent, transforming the conditions of its agency. And also that, the environment's always other agents that are acting on it too. And so agency is, if not fully relativized, then at least deeply relational.
And so the constitution of the epochal stamps in these terms
Mm,
is itself the product of the action of agents, right? It's not something that's
right.
just happening to us.
Yep.
It's something that we or agents in general are actively constituting. And then
Mhm.
things lock into a certain pattern for a time, but that itself was constituted by and will be, this process itself. Sorry.
Right, right, right. Well, there's a moment when Schürmann is talking about how the this slippage into ontotheology that I was talking about with that happens with Eckhart because of substance metaphysics and God is being is God, he says, and only being is, and so on, only God is. Um, that ontotheological slippage or residue obscures a phenomenological discovery contained in henology, um,
Mm.
which Schürmann says that this discovery in the Enneads um, has to do with the recognition of the way in which the one, as a process of unification, not as unity, but as a process of unification, is analogous to this idea of an order of interconnectedness. That yes, even though we want to maintain the ontological difference between being and beings, there's a way in which being can be described um, effectively as actually that interconnectivity between beings, right?
Mm.
And
Net,
here, what was that?
net of Indra.
The net of Indra, yeah. Um, and also the term that has often been used in the mystical literature and Judaism and Christianity is logos, um, right? This order of interconnectivity um, is logos, and the sorts of words that and phrases that Schürmann was using in this paper were very suggestive of that. But it's like logos not as noun but as verb, as activity. That's important to emphasize here, and I think it becomes a really effective way of rendering a relational ontology in terms of a form of spirituality that is deeply ecological, where we are in some ways um, immunized against this tendency to revert back to talking of God as a supreme being above everything, but instead recognizing God as the fellow sufferer, who inhabits the relationships between beings and is not somewhere else, is not somewhere beyond, but in fact in and among um, creatures, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I know even Schürmann is hesitating about doing theology here and wanting to keep this ontological without the becoming ontotheological. And I know this sort of terminology can be um, I don't want to say annoying to you. I think you're a good sport about it when I start using it, but I think it's still when we talk about inheriting history, um, atheism is still a form of theism. I would say it's still
Has it right there.
what's that?
Has it, has it right there in the name,
It has it right there in the name. And that, we can talk about non-theism. That's where John Vervaeke goes with this, which I think is just a way of acknowledging that the one beyond being and the ineffability of this and needing to be humble here. And just, and avoiding this temptation where, although I kind of like the metaphor where Eckhart says, God is like fire. Um,
Mm.
fire burns, fire transforms all things it touches into its
And who,
own nature.
who's he quoting again? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And the Heraclitus.
Who's the first person to use the term logos in the West,
There you
as well?
go. There you
Uh,
go. Yeah. So we're recovering the pre-Socratics. Um, and I like that. And it's, right before he says that, Eckhart says, God and I are one in this work. he acts and I become. Fire transforms all things it touches into its own nature. The wood does not change the fire into itself, but the fire changes the wood into itself. In the same way, we are transformed into God so that we may know him as he is. All sorts of problematic pronouns and, ontotheology going on there, and a hierarchy that, puts the fire above the wood.
He acts and I become. That's determinism.
Right.
And it's also, again, antithetical to a lot of the other things that Eckhart seems to be saying.
Right. And so we have to move instead to this understanding that I think is already, implicit in Aristotle, which is where Schürmann goes, that Aristotle says arche, the first, the origin is nothing in itself, but a mere ordering. And that to me is similar to what Whitehead says about eternal objects, that in some sense they're nothing in themselves. They don't act. They don't do anything. They are a provision of order for actualities to ingress. And so what gets foregrounded there is a process of actualization where the first, or the origin, the beginning, and the consequent, the what becomes, are not anymore separated in this hierarchical position of cause and effect, but rather we can reimagine the sort of theurgy that Eckhart's describing there, this process of energetic becoming, of actualization, in a way that's not privileging God as creator, but instead emphasizing God as relator, as I've put it before. Yeah.
And I love the way you put that. There's a lot there. So I think in the return to Aristotle, I just note in passing that Schürmann will also see elsewhere Aristotle as the kind of arch formulator of the teleocratic mode, in which the arche ontos is the first and the last. So it is in a sense a deterministic model, right? And it's a little bit like again, don't want to get into this right now, but the Peircean origin and end that Peirce thinks you need to have an evolutionary realist model, and I think that's up for grabs. So I think Schürmann, again, in slightly different writings, he has a whole book of essays on Aristotle, which I haven't read yet, but will sort of note an ambiguity in Aristotle's treatment of the arche, right? And maybe the teleocratic notion of the arche is what's being problematized by ontological anarchy, and that is necessary because that teleocratic notion of the arche is in fact the dominant notion of the arche, just as substance, it's the correlative substance metaphysics, right? In the history of Western metaphysics, and also why these guys, or Schürmann following Heidegger, wants to abandon the term metaphysics and have a distinction between that and ontology. But I really like all of this in terms of the ordering principle that is no thing in itself. So I think of it as like this. He does say the factor of coordination, or the pure constellation. So literally just the relationship amongst things that is nothing over and above that. Not an entity or a power, just a togetherness. Now, of course, this is why I would immediately just say don't call it God, because God is an object. God is, and even Eckhart is saying this, right? God is an object. God is an entity, and so don't call it God. And the fact of relationality also doesn't require any primordial entity, it only requires the process that's being articulated here, and also the process that's being articulated in Whitehead, but then maybe he proliferates objects. Again, we won't get into the fine details of this now, where we've been a few times, but maybe he proliferates objects more than is necessary. And again, in very much in passing, because I know you'd really want to problematize this, but I just want to poke you because I want to get to something else. There is a number of times in this essay, the term conceptual prehension is
I
used
saw that. Yeah, yeah.
is used directly and problematized. And so obviously it's not immediately, proximally, explicitly talking about what Whitehead means by conceptual prehension, but my issue with Whitehead and the eternal objects is precisely that it recapitulates the logic that is being problematized here. So maybe we'll get to that, maybe we won't, because I want to talk about energetic.
Does Schürmann cite Whitehead anywhere in his other work
Yeah,
that
not in any detail that I've seen. You know, I'm relatively early in my engagement with Schürmann, but he does have an essay on philosophy in America where he mentions Whitehead, you know, where he
Mhm.
talks about, you know, the modern history or the recent history of philosophy in America, and Whitehead certainly comes up. So he was certainly aware of him.
Yeah.
But
I mean,
yeah,
we need to get into the technicalities there because there are all these ways that when Whitehead talks about conceptual prehension, it's like always an incomplete ingression of the relevant internal objects. And I mean, I'm not sure exactly what you would want to problematize, but that would be an interesting conversation to have. I didn't assume he was trying to
no, I don't think he is.
reference Whitehead there, but
I don't think he is either, but it would be interesting to just have to, you know, another time to have that conversation, and also to talk about, you know, because he does get into the way, you know, the objects again in this exact same, you know, logic or formal description get in between us and you know
sure.
engagement.
But I
And
mean, Whitehead couldn't be clearer that he wants to, he doesn't use the term deconstruct, but he wants to be rid of representationalist
no,
epistemology.
no, no,
It's,
no,
you know,
I know. And but what I was going to say is that you know the precisely those things that most potently get in between us and the world, for lack of a better term, right now, are these ultimate you know, arche as objectified. And he says, you know, Platonism obscures blah blah blah, and I just say like God is that kind of thing, you know, God with a capital G is that kind of thing, and that's why I don't use that term. I'm
yeah.
totally, you know, I totally get it, as you know, structurally, I totally understand the usage of that term in Whitehead and all of that, but
No,
just
I would say there are certain modes of discourse where it's totally inappropriate. And also, um, God as concept, in a metaphysical project where you're defining the function that that concept is meant to serve. I mean, as Whitehead does, I think we could ask whether it's more distracting than it's worth, and maybe he should have used another word. But I think in other contexts, in pastoral contexts, you know, when it's used as a symbol instead of a concept, then maybe it's you know we can't avoid it on some level, and there are often replacements for it that end up functioning
I agree. I agree.
intersubjectively in the same way. So
And that's why it has to be grappled with and continually grappled with in a kind of open-ended way, which I think I'm, you know,
yeah.
fully willing to engage with it in that way. And
A
I'm
lot
not,
of spiritual but not religious people in Northern California will talk about the universe wants me to do this and that instead of God. I'm just like, okay.
and the important thing is in the way Peirce would describe it, to strip away the garb and reveal the relations. And then if you want to, having actually done that, put a bit of garb back on it, well, that's going to be your, which is God, you know, that's going to be your personal choice. For me, I just think that garb is too gaudy, you know,
Yeah.
like again, I'm in speculative metaphysics, there are other contexts that you're talking. Of course, we can't get away with it, and of course, it has all of these very, very vital functions in communities that are not necessarily communities that I'm directly involved with, right? So, but I don't at all ever want to disrespect other people's recourse to that term, especially as it has a vital function in their lived experience and in their communities. As a matter of speculative metaphysics, so specifically the way Whitehead is using it, that's where I have my argument about impoverishment.
Mm.
And I do think that that's in keeping with all of this, with the thrust of Eckhart's thought and this thought that we're describing here. That to me it's too colorful. It's got too much baggage, right? So it doesn't belong to me, for me, in that space, but I'm very happy to describe its function in that space and to go through that in great detail. It's just that to the extent that I have a positive conception, to the extent that I do, that term is not in that. And
Yeah.
that's just a totally personal
I
decision.
think, foundationalism is what happens when we mistake the second hypostasis
Yeah, fair.
for the first.
Yeah,
And the way in which, Eckhart will say that God derives from the Godhead, and Plotinus will have, the one beyond the intellect and beyond our ability to understand rationally, I think helps preserve some of that sense of the anarchy and the transconceptuality, or maybe not the subconceptuality, if you want. It's just not conceptual. It's very much, to my mind, like Whitehead's distinction between God and creativity. God,
I definitely agree with that, and I think it's absolutely Whitehead's saving grace, if I can put it that way. You know that I love his work. To put creativity first, right? Like, so he's very much in this tradition because of that move, I think,
but
right?
interestingly, he says that creativity is both one and many, right?
Sure,
And
sure.
so there's
But
something. It's clearly a callback to Neoplatonism, but also I think there's something novel in that it's just as much one as it is many in Whitehead.
yes, and I think that that's really important, and I think that that's actually very much developed by the likes of Rouillé, Simondon, and Deleuze, who, contra Badiou, Deleuze is not a thinker of the one, right? In the sense that there's always a multiplicity that a virtual multiplicity, let's say, that predates any actualization. And Simondon, goes into great detail with that in his models of individuation and the pre-individual milieu. And that is also a direct way, again, of tying it into, if one is interested in doing such a thing, the thought forms that drive non-equilibrium thermodynamics, right? So you're not talking about a primordial unity or homogeneity. And I do think that that's
Right.
important.
I mean, one of the things that seems to be happening here, to put this back in the context of the epical changes, is that it's very clear that as soon as you have this insight into, through mystical experience, the non-existence of God, or the nothingness at the core of existence, um, there's different ways you can respond to that joyously, as Nietzsche tried to, and as I think many mystics, going back to the Upanishads and going back to Eckhart, have. But they were these, they're special individuals who are somehow, I don't know, better
Yeah.
prepared for that experience. But now we're in a situation where the entire culture is faced with this nothingness and is not prepared for that. And there's a regression to a kind of fundamentalism that's insisting on the second hypostasis as the be all and end all, as the supreme
Yeah.
being, because of the fear of that groundlessness. And so now this isn't just a matter of initiation of these weird mystics, in the hermit on the hermit in living in the hermitage or in a hut or whatever. It's the whole of our modern culture, postmodern culture, that's confronting this. And so this is quite an urgent conversation that we're having. The meaning crisis, right? Everybody's talking about it. And
Well, and Schürmann is talking about it
yeah,
directly.
oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
And saying attention to these henologists, but importantly, the reading of them as process thinkers
Right.
is what is crucial to our age. And so I think a bunch of what we've been circling around here is that when we engage with Neoplatonism and look for models there, as we look for models all over the landscape of thought and the history of thought, we just have to be very, very careful, because there's been a whole lot of reification and hypostasization and confusion specifically in that lineage. And
Right.
even what Platonism comes to mean is, again, we're not saying that Plato felt that way or thought that way, or that Plotinus thought that way. We're just saying it's a
Yeah.
very common outcome of engaging with, and again, maybe it's, and this is the sort of trite mystical, or philosophy is a way of life, not a set of abstract intellectual categories or whatever way of saying it, but maybe it's engaging with these thought forms without the attendant practice. And of course, again, that's what Heidegger's about, is all about, is about recovering the originary, and again, dangerous notions of authenticity loom, but the originary experiences that, so get all of the conceptual structures out of the way so that you can actually have the experiences from which those structures are derived, because handling the thought forms, thinking with the thought forms without having the experience of cessation, of nirvana, of the fire going out, to very much mix metaphors and speak against Heraclitus and Eckhart there, is dangerous. Of course, apparently it's very dangerous to do what Heidegger was doing as well. But
well, because I mean, as Schürmann puts it, at our age, this discovery of the nothingness engenders dizziness and anxiety, and the recoil from that anxiety in an attempt to find some anchor, some solid foundation, very much has. This isn't just a metaphysical problem; it's a political one. As he puts it later, today the task is one of unlearning the search for one measure giving ultimate authority. And look around, we're seeing the rise of authoritarians everywhere who promise to fix all the problems, by eliminating those unruly others that are getting in the way of the imposition of the perfect order that we think we had and lost. So this is dangerous. And the danger of Heidegger's project of authenticity is very much still in the air. And so, how do we confront this anxiety, this dizziness? I think maybe, I always go back to death, and the way that so much of our relationship to technology is as a new form of supernaturalism, right? That can,
as though we haven't read the Epic of Gilgamesh, like it's
and as if this story doesn't have a tragic ending, because there are new religions that are being born right out of the core of the most scientific, materialist worldview of transhumanism that imagines that technology is going to be able to allow us to transcend death. And that I don't think is the right response to this anxiety.
No. And I think there is, obviously it's something you're going to agree strongly on, and part of what we've been exploring in all these dialogues, but there is a way through contemporary science. And of course, I think, understanding the process of evolution, and it's, ecologically, so the process of diachronic and synchronic relationality, but a very, very strong lesson of impermanence arises from that, and from this vision of these nested temporal scales, which again, I think the FEP does give us nice models of. Not to say that those models can't be, like bloody evolutionary thought, how you can handle these things incredibly badly and end up with eugenics or whatever, you can end up with model reification in the cognitivist interpretation of predictive processing or whatever, like I'm not endorsing particular applications of these thought forms. I am saying that there is a way through them, and an important task to be done for articulating that way and showing how these thought forms are, again, we don't want to end up recovering some kind of essentialist naturalism by saying, well, as science shows us, this is just the way things are, so we just have to deal with it. That's also going to be problematic. There's a few things I really quickly want to run through, which would be some of the ways of thinking against objects and against their correlates, or against teleocracy. But I was sort of starting on with, in response to your discussion of the the ordering that is no thing in itself. So just like really quickly, the pure constellation, not an entity or a power, just togetherness. And it doesn't require, we got into the Whitehead weeds, which I fully poked you and triggered the response, elicited from you or solicited from you. But the fact of relationality just doesn't require anything over and above it, right? Which is what we're saying, right? It just derives from some kind of unity or a singularity, if we're into that kind of, and that could be a multiplicity, an it's not a so unity sounds wrong in that sense, but things were together and thus they are together, essentially, right? There's no elsewhere, hence transcendence sounds like a problem there as well. There's no elsewhere. Everything is together, primordially entangled, just, and we don't need any specific entity, which is the thing over and above that togetherness, to guarantee this. So, and that's obviously correlate to there being no substantial ground, etc. But so well, a few things that I'll just run through really quickly. I like so Wesen in the Eckhartian mode is translated by Schürmann as essentializing or unfolding. So it's evolution, right? But essentializing, and I've defined evolution as anti-essentialism. Unfolding is just the etymological root of evolutio, right? But what is essential is the generative activity or essentializing, right? It's differentiating actualization, and it's the generation, the heterogenesis of essences, which then themselves become not grounding but contingent and context specific.
His emphasis on the participle was really clear, and I thought well done there. And so adding the ing to essence, I think, really helps us avoid the warning sirens that might go off when we hear essence otherwise.
And to the point that we've been talking about all the, throughout, I just like this quote about, you're talking about the confusion of the second hypothesization for something ultimate. One differs from mind, and the Godhead from God as a process or event differs from a thing. That's just a very succinct way of putting it. And when you were talking about mind and reason, and Plotinus, transcending mind and reason, or intelligibility, the non-intelligibility of the non-thing, which is the Godhead, there are views into the discussion of relevance realization and the difference between what organisms are bound to do by setting their own reference frames and computability. So intelligibility is like computability, which is determinacy with regard to some specific preset reference frame, as opposed to the capacity to constitute reference frames. But one of the, again, something we won't get into because I want to just talk about energeia for a second as well. But one of the issues with the argument against computationalism there is that the reference frames are very much nested, right? So yes, a computer might have some fundamental reference frame that's determined, like predetermined, but that doesn't necessarily mean it can't constitute reference frames on top of that. And organisms are indeed themselves in that position with regard to any given epochal context that they're in. So we've talked about this many times, but like the cosmic epoch, right, is a fundamental reference frame. If you're generalizing this mode of thought and thinking of the laws as habits and all of that, organisms are always in contexts which ground the proliferation of their own autonomous specific reference frames, right? They're not in a void and then as some individual cell or whatever constituting a reference frame from nothing, not at all. That's an issue with the way the relevance, that paper with, naturalizing relevance realization and the way that Jaeger has been talking about it. So that's just something to plant a flag for. Like the nested model is very, very important. It's not just a matter of like ex nihilo constitution of a reference frame in the sense that organisms don't do that. But if you generalize this model all the way, the cosmos does that in some sense, right? That unless there have always been reference frames, the indeterminate, this is a quote now, the indeterminate or pure is and the determinate sum of beings, which is the The indeterminate is the pure is, which is this, again, groundless ground. It acts and is itself pure acting. It's no object, it's act. It's purely this active principle. And what you kind of get from this, though, is that if that is, again, if we're erecting in some sense another first, if we're trying to think the most impoverished first that we can think, as you and I have discussed many times, yeah, there's no ex nihilo in the classic sense, right? The classical ex nihilo. But what simply is indeed no thing. And
Yeah.
you thus can, in fact, according to this model, get some things from no thing, right? And then
Right.
last thing I'll say, and then I'll let you respond. I'm just rushing through because I figure we're probably going to end soon. But Schürmann also said, I think these are all hopefully relevant to each other. What counts less is the variation Eckhart, plays on the Christian dogma than the process character of identity. So identities, again, are constituted through process. This is all just what we've been talking about. Or the variation on the Aristotelian notion of energeia. Now, you brought that up. So energeia, and you know Aristotle, I'm sure, better than I do, but energeia is activity or operation that is self-subsistent in the sense that it's not oriented towards any goal, right? It's just pure activity. Whereas kinesis is the movement. And I think we talked about this in the last time, like, because I said it moves, and you were like, no, that's Galilean. And obviously, for sure, it's a poor metaphor for the process of actualization that we're talking about. And this would be the difference between energeia and kinesis, right? Energeia is activity, whereas kinesis is movement. And movement is always directional, is towards or away something in space, right? And so what this means, though, which is a persistent refrain in our talks and in our talks about evolutionary theory, if energeia is first, there's no global telos. So local and directed goal-oriented processes, which are movement, kinesis, are emergent from a basic activity, right? So it itself is not going anywhere. So at the level of the whole, you're not moving in any particular. We have emergent, directionality, and that's also why something else will bracket the principle of least action is a local principle. It's how is it, what is the path of least action in this very, very specific ecological, very context-dependent set of circumstances. And it globalizes in the sense that it applies to all movement. So it's a fundamental principle in physics. But it contributes, we might say, to a kind of global telos of everything that is. But that global telos is not really fundamentally oriented. It is in the sense of the one, it's just a pure togetherness. Everything's going somewhere because it's going together, because the principle of least action is an ecological, relational, context-specific, local principle. So there's a way this local order and local kinesis proliferates to create a kind of like the image of or the appearance of a global telos. But if energeia comes first, that, strictly speaking, is emergent. So there isn't a global telos at the level of principle, right?
Yeah. No, I'm happy with all of that. It reminds me, yeah, we should wrap up. I'm starving. I haven't eaten dinner yet, but it reminds me of what Schürmann says about, he uses topos and topology a lot. And I think, the question that arises for me there is like you're saying about local versus global teleology, it's the topological frame is, well, how do we get there from here? And I think in Whitehead's framework, it's very easy to misinterpret the primordial nature of God as some kind of global telos, but that primordial nature of God is deficient in actuality and only gains actualization through each occasion of experience, which interprets via kind of intensive relevance how that primordial eros is it interprets how it what it means from here, what it means from some locus, right? And so the only, like, if you were to ask where is the primordial nature of God, well, it's only ever in each actual occasion, of experience. It is nowhere else. It's not above, or it's not before in any temporal sense. You might say, yeah, I think it's the primordial nature and the actualization of each occasion are co-dependently co-arising, if you want. You know, and so I think that allows us to read Whitehead's process ontology as very much in the spirit of putting energeia first, which is to say there's a radical distribution, an anarchic distribution of teloi, and
Mhm.
rather than a sole single source that is large and in charge and directing the whole thing towards one final destination.
Yeah, no, I recognize that, and I think that's beautifully put. And the remaining problem is the pre-definite nature of the eternal objects that are correlative to the primordial nature. And I know what he's getting at there, but I think, and I also agree with, as you've articulated it previously, the Roycean criticism of Bergson, which, and the notion of transcendental illusion, and the confusion of the possible and the virtual, which Deleuze will make a lot of hay out of. So I think that that's right, but I think as a matter of primordial natures, um,
Mhm.
I think that again, Simondon and the way Deleuze mobilizes some of that, and maybe Rouillère, but I'm uncertain with Rouillère. Sometimes I feel like he's just got his themes as his animating. It
Mm.
almost there's a way he flirts with holomorphism in a way that I think this is every Rouillerian is going to say this is totally unfair, and it probably is. But I think maybe Simondon, who is much more difficult to read, has it slightly more refined. But I think Deleuze is drawing, as well as obviously on Bergson, he's drawing on those guys pretty heavily.
Always helpful to be obscure so that you can't be directly criticized.
Yeah.
But
Well, what I mean, Rouillet is doing it a lot, obviously, with embryology, but Simondon is really trying to work through all these different domains of the sciences in quite
right.
significant technical detail to try and articulate this.
I mean, yeah, it could be though that what Whitehead really means is something more like primordial naturing or primordial essentializing in the sense that
Well,
um
that's clear, but
Schürmann.
that's almost creativity itself, or energeia, right? Which is
Well,
that.
yeah, because like I don't think it's, and this we'll have to pick this up in a future discussion because there's so much here to unpack. But to say that you're worried about the way that Whitehead has the eternal objects as like predefined or predefinite, the eternal objects they're infinite, right? And so and the divine, the primordial naturing, I'll say, of the eternal objects is not like a fixed like stamp of some structure onto the realm of possibility, because he's very much emphasizing that as the creative advance unfolds, the eternal is enriched by what occurs, and so there's a feeding back onto it, and so it's always that primordial envisagement is always being
It's a
um,
drifting non-equilibrium steady state for the whole cosmos, essentially, right?
yeah, yeah.
And we talked about it a lot of times as the attractor, and I mean that it kind of works. But the predefinite thing, as opposed to the kind of flux of tensions, this topological vision where you do have a kind of energetic landscape. Again, it's not actually energetic, but the analogy, you have a landscape that things can flow across, which is biasing. There are distributions,
Mhm.
etc., but there aren't definite objects that are predefined. Like what the actualization is the coming into, like, is the definite defining, determining process, and
Right.
that happens in a radically, as Schürmann says. I did have a good quote for that as well, but that happens in a radically context dependent mode, you know, like that is what, hang on, where's that bloody, um, there was a good quote. I mean, we know this because we're talking about it all the time, but the process of actualization is the coming into togetherness, like the coming into a particular epoch defined by, again, nested. Oh, I keep doing this hierarchy, nested, you know, whatever. But they're nested temporal scales, right? So the space, any spatial way of thinking about it is completely metaphorical, you know, Pache, Bergson, again. But yeah, that it's the coming into being, the process of actualization that results in definiteness. Even though, of course, from any particular situation, and we're in media res, you know, we're thrown in the Heideggerian sense. Of course, we can envision, and that's why, you know, the Roycian critique of Bergson is still apt. We can envision and we can study our past and see, you know, things might have been some other way or whatever, and we can then define particular possibilities as a result of that, and try to manifest them, and that's part of what it is to be an agent. But that process itself requires, you know, agents of some degree of sophistication or complexity, is not itself primordial. The primordial thing is more about continuity and a lack of pre-definiteness. That's what I want, because that's the more anarchic view, and that's the more impoverished view, basically, because I worry too much about where's that definiteness coming from. You know, like we're always going to have some it just is, and here it's pure activity, right? And then we need to have this principle of, well, it's pure activity which is biased somehow by like tension, you know, and we take analogies from crystallization in Simondon's sense, or whatever. And we're always limited because our analogies, especially as we're reaching into science, are derived from, you know, situations we can study in which there's this massive history of like definiteness, of actualization that is undergirding that. And so when we're trying to talk about the attractor and its formation, we're always going to be in some sort of poetic whatever,
Yeah.
speculative.
I mean, I think of Eckhart's saying, "I pray that God rid me of God. I pray God to rid me of God." Um, and you know, there are all these mystical breakthroughs or ruptures in the theological tradition, which otherwise becomes onto theological. Like, you know, when we say it just is, think of, you know, when Moses asked God for God's name, and God says, "I am that I am." And so then I think again of, it's not an it, it's, you know, as Saint Augustine said, it's more intimate than I am to myself. And there's a sense in which, again, the groundlessness at the core of the soul is precisely the nothingness of the one beyond being. And so, you know, we have to be willing to face the anxiety which arises when we touch that anarchic abyss. And, you know, Heidegger's term about appropriating that, making that our own, it's not even something that we can make our own. It's like each of us has our own unique relationship with that. And so a synonym for God, as far as I'm concerned, in the deepest sense of what that term should mean, would be I. And then it's, you know, obviously you want to avoid some kind of crass like Messiah complex, but at the same time, no one else can refer to me with that pronoun. You know, and so there's something about that mystical paradox of the one within that I think can really help provoke a renewal of our relationship to the mystery of existence.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, I think metaphysically, speculative metaphysically, in terms of speculative metaphysics, there's that aspect of Leibniz, obviously, the monad as its unique, you know, reflection, inflection of the whole, and obviously that's fully present in Whitehead, right? Which he, I guess, takes from Leibniz, because he says it in a very Leibnizian way. And yeah, there's also then a kind of this is opening a can of worms too, but it's like there's a nominalism lurking there,
Mm.
and because of this, at that level, at that ultimate level, there's all these unique loci which can't be assimilated to any real generals, and they are the ultimately real things. Um, and
Mm.
part of what we're grappling with, though, is the how do we in a similar way, how do we respond to this nothingness? How do we respond to this void, this abyss? It's like, how do we respond to that nominalism? So how do we have a vision of constructed, but in the radically pre-social, pre-cultural, pre-human constructivist metaphysics sense, so evolutionary metaphysics, how do we have constructed generals, even though we're predicating things on something that kind of looks like nominalism? So we're having our cake and eating it too, and not saying that, we need to gravitate completely to one side of that debate. Um,
Yeah.
and to your point, though, and I just want to signal my full agreement that all of that, Christian mystic language um, articulates all of this very beautifully. And so it's not a matter of saying this is not present in that tradition, clearly. So the language of God and the Godhead beyond God and all of that, and so it's beautiful, and I find a great deal of value in that, and I actually find, without needing to adopt it, I find a certain, I guess, comfort. I mean, I think it's therapeutic language, and I find that, but I find, by going from tradition to tradition and finding, and so there's a perennialism that's lurking here, and all of that, but finding sort of similar thought forms. And for
Yeah.
me, of course, that's linking back into my evolutionary thinking when I say, well, these thought forms are in fact the thought forms of a generalized evolutionary thought, which of course is a fully Whiteheadian way of seeing things, or a Persian way, or whatever. Um, to me, I guess that perception of intellectually, but then I have my various practices, that perception of a kind of togetherness, which doesn't require something transcendent to guarantee it, but, is the way things are, is what it is to be a thing, is to be defined again in this context specific relational manner, togetherness. I do find some kind of, not that I'm not like terrified and the world is like extremely frightening, but I find a certain comfort, not apathetic. I'm wary of that again as well, but I find a certain comfort in the way those things come together. And like I said, it may well be that I am a crazy person, for it's like the number 23, once you imbibe this thought form, you just project it on. So am I doing this kind of projective violence, which is exactly the thing that the Heidegger Schürmann axis was warning, or basically all mystical thought is warning against to some degree, because I found this particular, and my only answer to that is that I just try to impoverish it as much as possible. And that's my, like I try to make it as, and that's why I have to say I can't have the God bit per
Yeah.
se, because it's got to be as denuded as possible in that.
Well, that's what makes these conversations so generative. Because I mean, I share that, I have that impulse too, but I think I also, not saying you don't, but I love the poetry of this, of these traditions, and I agree. There's not to be perennial about it, but there's so much across traditions that speaks to this, the profundity of this nothingness in a way that allows us to relate to it joyously and
Yeah.
compassionately, or have compassion as the response to encountering it, um, rather than for the nothingness and the encounter with it to become nihilism and apathy.
Yeah.
So
Because it's not enough in and of itself, though, and that's the really important thing. It's like
mm,
you have that and you find comfort in that, but it is not, because there's either this, again, this apathy of, well, there's a lot of escapism, spiritual bypassing, blah blah blah, in meditative practice. You can have that. It's not enough. It's just a part of one's mode of engagement with the world, and there are lots of ways of engaging with the world. And obviously, I find a lot of, like, it's hard for me coming back actually from a trip like the one that I've just had, in a certain sense, because it's so vibrant. Like, I'm just talking to a lot of people, and it's like people are so, they're trying to address snakebite in India. 60,000 people are done, like, people are really engaged. And again, I don't want to project a false universal onto Indians and say, look, Indians are so engaged in their local context and Westerners are all alienated and neurotic, but I will traverse that thought form without clinging to it, and then I'll problematize it and deconstruct it for myself. But yeah, no, again, I do love the poetry, and again, I find a lot of comfort in it because it's reading for company. It's not necessarily like I wouldn't go and read a bunch of contemplative literature perhaps anymore to have a kind of revelation of some structure that is completely unknown. I mean, maybe, but that is completely unknown to me. But it's more like, wow, you can talk about it in all these different ways, and some of these people, but not all of them, are very beautiful writers. And then it's again building back into some local context. This is how that interacted with the epochal stamp of their times and everything. And it's just a reflection of the human experience, but then by porting it into biology and blah blah blah, it's the experience of organisms. It's the togetherness of the shebang. And I don't know, something about that is when one is engaging with it, and if privileged and blessed enough to be able to have conversations like this, where we can kind of vibe on these ideas and explore them intellectually as well. That's comforting. But to just want to note that the togetherness, like being in India, it's a lot about being with a bunch of people and having really stimulating, enlivening conversations and relations with them, as much as it's about being in the rainforest and like spotting arboreal vipers and all the other kind of things that I absolutely love to do. All of that is about being present in a certain kind of togetherness and relationality. And maybe this is trite and obvious, but again, a big part of our issue today is alienation, in the sense that so much of our relationships, I mean, even this, I would much rather we were together in person, but this is, because we've cultivated a dynamic over an extended period of time, and we have different modes of communication and whatever, I can access a certain connection.
Yeah. I mean, we're in different spaces or places, but I've probably spent more time with you than I have with many of my best friends here, in the Bay. So over the last couple of years, just in terms of, yeah.
Exactly. And so it is, again, the comfort comes from exploring all of this with others, and relating to others,
Mm-hmm. Well, this was a short article, but obviously so generative. So I'm glad you brought it to our attention. But yeah, we should probably leave it there.